The hall doors slammed open, and Illyra Voss knew, before anyone said a word, that her life was about to be handed away like an unwanted coin. Her father stood at the head of the long table, his face pale and slick with sweat, a letter trembling in his hand. Her mother sat beside him, arms crossed, refusing to look in Illyra's direction. Her two older sisters, Marisol and Ophelia, lounged near the fireplace, whispering to each other behind painted fans, their eyes flicking toward Illyra with something close to hunger. "Sit down," her father said, though his voice cracked in the middle of the command. Illyra sat. She had learned long ago that obedience was the only currency that kept her safe in this house. She smoothed her plain gray dress over her knees and folded her hands, waiting. "The king has sent his decree," her father continued. "Every noble house in the eastern provinces must offer a daughter for the royal tribute. One girl, one bride. In exchange, our lands are spared from the war tax, and our borders remain untouched by his soldiers." A cold weight settled in Illyra's stomach. She had heard the rumors, same as everyone else in the kingdom. King Caleb Ashgrave was not a man who ruled with mercy. He was a man who ruled with fear, a king so feared that servants lowered their voices just speaking his name. A king whose last 3 brides had vanished from the palace and were never seen again, their fate spoken of only in frightened murmurs. "Which one of us goes?" Ophelia asked sharply, straightening in her chair, her painted fan snapping shut. Their mother's eyes swept across her daughters, calculating, the way she might inspect livestock before a sale. Marisol was too valuable, promised already to a wealthy merchant's son from the capital. Ophelia had caught the eye of a visiting duke just last season, a match too important to risk. That left only one daughter whose absence would cost the family nothing. "Illyra," her mother said, the name falling from her lips like something distasteful. "She goes." No one argued. No one hesitated. Illyra watched her father's shoulders sag with relief, watched her sisters exchange a private, satisfied glance, watched her mother return to her needlework as though the matter had already been settled days ago, as though this conversation was simply a formality before the inevitable. "I am the one who goes," Illyra repeated quietly, testing the words on her tongue, waiting for someone, anyone, to object. No one did. She had grown up in this house as the daughter nobody wanted, the third girl born when her parents had prayed for a son, the child blamed for every misfortune that touched the family's fortune. She had been given the smallest room, the plainest clothes, the last portion at the table. Her sisters called her the useless one when they were feeling generous, and worse when they were not. She had stopped expecting kindness from this family years ago. She had never stopped hoping for it, though. That hope, small and stubborn, was the last thing left inside her that still felt like her own. "You should be grateful," her mother said without looking up from her stitching. "The king is offering you a life of luxury. Silk gowns, jewels, a palace to call home. Girls across the kingdom would trade places with you in a heartbeat." Illyra almost laughed. Luxury, her mother called it. A cage with golden bars was still a cage, and everyone in this room knew what waited for the king's brides behind those bars. But there was no use arguing. There had never been any use arguing in this house. "When do I leave?" she asked instead. "Tomorrow," her father said, not meeting her eyes. "The royal carriage arrives at dawn." That night, Illyra packed the few things she owned into a small traveling case. A worn wool shawl, a wooden comb that had belonged to her grandmother, the only relative who had ever shown her real affection before she passed. A single silver ring, too small now for her finger, that she kept simply because it was the only gift she had ever received that wasn't second-hand or broken. Her younger brother, Tobias, slipped into her room just before midnight, his eyes wide and red-rimmed in the candlelight. "They shouldn't send you," he whispered, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed. He was only 12, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to know it was wrong. "I heard Father talking. He said if you refused, they would have sent me instead. Is that true?" Illyra's chest tightened. She had heard the same conversation through the thin walls of the house, her father's voice low and desperate, explaining to her mother that a son could not be spared, that the family line depended on Tobias, that a daughter, especially this daughter, was expendable in ways a son never could be. "It doesn't matter now," she said gently, brushing his hair back from his forehead, the way she used to when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "I'm the one going. You'll stay here, and you'll grow up, and you'll be a good man, better than anyone in this family deserves." "But what if the stories are true?" Tobias's voice cracked. "What if the king really did something to his other brides? What if he—" "Hush," Elira said, though her own hands trembled as she said it. "I'll be fine. I always am." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Tobias let himself believe it anyway, because the alternative was unbearable. He hugged her tightly before he left, whispering that he would find a way to visit her someday, that he would never forget what their family had done. Elira held on to those words long after he had gone, turning them over in her mind like a small stone she could carry in her pocket for comfort. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, trying to imagine what waited for her at the end of the road to the capital. She pictured cold stone hallways. She pictured a throne room draped in shadow. She pictured a king with a temper sharp enough to cut, a man who had already broken 3 other women before her, women who had probably arrived with more hope than she carried now. She would not make that mistake. She would arrive expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, protecting the small, stubborn part of herself that had survived 17 years in a house that never wanted her. If the king intended to break her too, he would find there was very little left to break. Dawn came gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The royal carriage that arrived was not the gilded, silk-lined coach Elira had imagined from stories. It was plain, weathered, clearly not meant for a bride of honor, but for cargo that needed transporting with the least possible expense. Even in this, her family found a way to remind her of her place. Her mother did not come outside to say farewell. Her father offered a stiff nod from the doorway, already turning back into the house before the carriage door had even closed. Marisol and Ophelia watched from an upstairs window, their expressions unreadable, though Elira thought she saw the faintest curl of satisfaction on Ophelia's lips. Only Tobias ran alongside the carriage as it pulled away, his small legs pumping hard against the mud, until the horses picked up speed and left him behind on the road, growing smaller and smaller, until the bend in the path swallowed him from view entirely. Elira pressed her hand against the cold glass of the carriage window, and did not cry. She had promised herself, sometime in the long, sleepless hours of the night, that she would not give her family the satisfaction of tears, not even tears they would never see. Whatever waited for her in the capital, she would face it with her back straight and her chin lifted, the way her grandmother had taught her, the only lesson from this family that she intended to carry forward. The journey to the capital took 3 days. The carriage rattled over rutted roads, through small villages where children ran alongside shouting for coins, through dense forests where the trees grew so close together that daylight barely reached the ground. Elira spent most of the journey in silence, watching the world blur past the window, her traveling case clutched in her lap like a shield. On the second night, the carriage stopped at a roadside inn for rest, the guards escorting her. 2 grim-faced men in the king's colors spoke little, and treated her with the same indifference one might show a piece of furniture being delivered. She overheard them talking outside her door that night, their voices low, but not quite low enough. "Poor girl doesn't know what she's walking into," one of them muttered. "None of them ever do," the other replied. 3 brides in 3 years. You'd think word would spread, families would refuse to send their daughters. They're too afraid of the war tax. Better to lose a daughter than lose everything. You believe the stories? About what he did to them? A pause. I believe he's not fully a man, not in the way you or I are. My cousin serves in the palace kitchens. She says the old bloodline runs through him, the wolf blood, the kind the histories talk about from before the old wars. She says on nights of the full moon, the guards double at every door, and no one asks questions about why. Elira lay rigid on the thin inn mattress, every word slipping through the wall like ice water down her spine. A wolf, not just a cruel king, but something else entirely, something the old stories warned children about before bed. She thought of the 3 missing brides, and felt her resolve waver for the first time since leaving home. But wavering solved nothing. She had no choice, no path that led anywhere but forward. So she closed her eyes, and forced her breathing to slow, and eventually, exhaustion pulled her under, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. They reached the capital on the morning of the third day. Illyra had never seen a city so large, towers of pale stone rising higher than she thought buildings could reach, streets crowded with merchants and nobles and soldiers in gleaming armor, the air thick with the smell of bread and smoke and distant sea salt. Under any other circumstances, she might have found it beautiful. Instead, every grand archway and looming tower felt like another step deeper into a trap she could not escape. The palace itself rose above the city like a mountain of white and gray stone, its highest towers disappearing into the low clouds. Illyra's carriage passed through 3 separate gates, each guarded by soldiers who inspected the king's seal on the carriage door before waving them through without a single word to her. No one greeted her at the entrance. No servants rushed forward with warm cloaks or welcoming smiles, the way she had imagined royal brides might be received. Instead, a stern woman in dark robes, introduced only as Mistress Yara, the keeper of the household, looked her over with obvious disapproval, taking in her plain traveling dress and unstyled hair with a curled lip. "This is what they sent," Mistress Yara muttered, more to herself than to Illyra. "Well, come along. The king does not like to be kept waiting, and today of all days, patience is not a virtue he possesses." Illyra followed her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past tapestries depicting battles and hunts, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track her as she passed. Servants scurried out of their path, none of them making eye contact, none of them offering so much as a word of comfort or welcome. "What happens now?" Illyra finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Mistress Yara did not slow her pace. "Now you are presented to the king. What happens after that is entirely up to him." The words settled over Illyra like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward with dread. She thought of the whispered stories from the inn, the missing brides, the wolf blood running beneath a crown. She thought of her family, warm and safe in their house, while she walked toward whatever fate awaited her in this cold, echoing palace. They stopped before a massive set of double doors carved with images of wolves running through a forest, their eyes inlaid with dark stone that seemed to catch the torchlight and hold it. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their faces carved from the same stone as the walls around them. "Straighten your dress," Mistress Yara instructed curtly. "Keep your eyes low unless he addresses you directly. Do not speak unless spoken to. Whatever you do not run. It only makes things worse." Illyra's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone in the corridor could hear it. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands, lifted her chin the way her grandmother had taught her, and forced her spine straight, despite every instinct screaming at her to turn and flee back down the corridor, back through the gates, back to a life that had never wanted her, but had at least been familiar. The doors began to open. Golden light spilled out from the throne room beyond, along with the low murmur of a gathered court, dozens of voices that fell silent one by one as they noticed her standing in the doorway. Illyra took a breath, steadied herself, and stepped forward into whatever waited for her inside, unaware that the moment she crossed that threshold, everything she believed about her own worth was about to be shattered in a way she could never have imagined. The throne room was vast, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow far above, its walls lined with nobles, dressed in colors so rich they seemed to glow in the torchlight. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she walked the long carpet leading to the throne at the far end, her worn traveling shoes silent against the stone floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. And there, seated upon a throne carved from dark wood and iron, was King Caleb Ashgrave. He was younger than she expected, though every line of his face carried the weight of a man who had ruled through hardship and blood. His dark hair fell loose around a face carved sharp and severe, and his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold a color too intense to be entirely human, a deep amber that caught the light like something burning from within. He sat with the stillness of a predator at rest, one hand resting against the arm of his throne, watching her approach with an expression she could not read. Illyra stopped at the base of the dais and lowered herself into the deepest curtsy she had ever performed, her eyes fixed on the floor, exactly as Mistress Yara had instructed. Silence stretched through the throne room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of torches along the walls. Then she heard it, a sharp intake of breath from the throne above her. The creak of wood as the king shifted forward, suddenly, unmistakably tense. She dared to lift her eyes. King Caleb Ashgrave, the ruthless monarch feared across the entire kingdom, the man rumored to have destroyed 3 brides before her, was staring at her as though she had struck him. His nostrils flared, his hands gripped the arms of his throne so tightly the wood groaned in protest, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Alira saw something flicker across his sharp, severe features that looked, impossibly, like shock. The court began to murmur, confused whispers rippling from noble to noble, as they watched their unshakable king rise slowly from his throne, his amber eyes never once leaving her face, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something far more dangerous, something Alira did not yet have a name for. Whatever she had expected walking into this room, it was not this. And as the silence stretched and the king took his first step down from the dais toward her, Alira realized with a cold, uncertain thrill that nothing about this story would unfold the way she had imagined. The king took the steps down from his throne one at a time, and with every step, the murmuring court grew quieter, until the only sound in the vast room was the soft fall of his boots against stone. Alira did not move. She did not dare. Mistress Yara's instructions echoed in her mind. Keep your eyes low, do not speak, do not run. But she found she could not tear her gaze away from the king's face, as he closed the distance between them. His amber eyes had not left hers since the moment she raised her head, and the intensity in them was unlike anything she had ever seen directed at her before. Not anger, not cruelty, but something raw and searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in front of him without warning. He stopped only a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint tremor in his jaw, the way his broad shoulders rose and fell with breaths that seemed harder to control than they should have been for a man of his composure. Up close, he was even more striking than he had appeared from the base of the dais, tall and broad, dressed in dark clothing trimmed with silver that caught the torchlight whenever he moved. "Your name," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, carrying an authority that made the request sound like a command, even though the words themselves were simple. "Elira," she managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Elira Voss, Your Majesty." Something shifted behind his eyes when she said her name, as though he were memorizing it, carving it into some permanent place inside himself. The silence stretched a beat too long, and Alira became acutely aware of every noble in the room watching this strange exchange, their confusion palpable in the air. "Leave us," the king said suddenly, his voice carrying across the entire throne room, without him ever raising it above a normal tone. "All of you, now." For a moment, no one moved, as though the court could not quite believe what they had heard. Then, one by one, the nobles began to file toward the doors, their whispered questions and startled glances trailing behind them like smoke. Mistress Yara hesitated near the entrance, clearly uncertain whether the command applied to her as well, until the king's sharp glance in her direction sent her scurrying out with the rest. Within minutes, the throne room stood empty, except for the two of them, the massive doors closing with a heavy, final sound that echoed off the stone walls. Alira's heart hammered so loudly she was certain the king could hear it. She had heard the stories about brides who vanished, about a temper sharp enough to end a life without hesitation, and now she was alone with him in a room the size of a cathedral, with no one left to witness whatever happened next. "You're frightened," the king observed, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a softness she had not expected from a man with such a fearsome reputation. "Should I not be?" Alira asked before she could stop herself, the words slipping out despite every instinct telling her to remain silent. She braced immediately for punishment, for anger, for the temper the stories had warned her about. Instead, the king's expression flickered with something that looked almost like regret. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you shouldn't have to be, but I understand why you are." He turned away from her then, running a hand through his dark hair, pacing a few steps before stopping and facing her again, as though he were wrestling with words he did not quite know how to say. Alira watched him, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor, the sharp, commanding king from moments ago, replaced by someone who seemed almost uncertain, almost human. "Do you know why the tribute was demanded?" he asked finally. Alira shook her head. "Only that our lands would be spared war if a daughter was sent. That is the reason given to the noble houses," the king said. "It is not the true reason. Or rather, it is only part of it." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her in place at the same time. "There is a bond among my bloodline, Alira Voss, something older than the crown itself. My people call it a fated bond. It cannot be arranged, cannot be forced, cannot be summoned by wealth or politics or war. It simply happens, once, if it happens at all, and when it does, there is no mistaking it." Alira frowned, uncertain where this explanation was leading, though a strange, uneasy feeling had begun to build low in her stomach. "The moment you walked into this room," the king continued, his voice lower now, almost strained, "I knew. Your scent, the way it reached me before I even saw your face. It is unlike anything I have encountered in all my years on this throne. Jasmine, and something beneath it, rain against warm stone. I have never smelled anything like it in my life." He shook his head slowly, as though still trying to process what he was saying even as he said it. "You are my fated mate, Alira. The bond has chosen you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Alira stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the cruelty she had been warned to expect, but his expression held nothing but a strange, vulnerable honesty that made the whole moment feel even more surreal. "That's not possible," she said finally, because it was the only thing she could think to say. "I'm nobody. My own family sent me here because they didn't want me. I'm not the sort of person fate would choose for anything." Something dark passed across the king's face, and for a moment, Alira feared she had angered him, but when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Your family was wrong about you," he said, "and I intend to prove it, starting today." Alira did not know how to respond to that. No one, in 17 years, had ever spoken to her with such conviction, such certainty that she was worth something. She had spent her entire life being told, in ways large and small, that she was the disappointment, the burden, the daughter no one wanted. To hear a king, a stranger, a man the entire kingdom feared, speak to her as though she mattered, was almost harder to accept than the fear she had walked in with. "I don't understand," she admitted quietly. "The stories say you've had 3 brides before me, that they disappeared. That something happened to them." The king's jaw tightened, and for a moment, real pain flickered across his features. "The 3 women who came before you were not my mates," he said. "They were political arrangements, forced upon me by the council, in hopes of securing alliances or heirs. I never claimed any of them, never touched them beyond what courtesy required. When the bond did not form, when it became clear I felt nothing toward them, they were quietly returned to their families with generous compensation and instructions never to speak of the arrangement." Then the stories about them vanishing. "Rumors," the king said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. "Started by nobles who wanted my throne, or by families ashamed that their daughters failed to secure a permanent match with the crown. I have never harmed a bride, Alira. I have never harmed anyone who did not first raise a blade against me or mine." He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "I know the reputation that precedes me. I have done little to correct it, because until this moment, I had no reason to care what anyone believed about me. But I care what you believe." Alira studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that this was some elaborate trick designed to lower her guard before something worse. But all she found was raw sincerity, uncomfortable and unpracticed, as though kindness were a language he was only now learning to speak. "Why would you care?" she asked softly. "You just met me." "Because the bond does not lie," he said. "Whatever I feel when I look at you, whatever pulled me from that throne the moment you walked through those doors, it is not something I chose. It is something that chose me, the same way it has chosen you, whether you believe it yet or not." He took a slow step closer, stopping when he saw her tense, giving her space even as his eyes remained fixed on hers. "I will not force anything on you, Alira. Not this bond, not this crown, not anything. But I am asking you to give me the chance to show you that not every place you have known has to be like the one you came from. Elira's throat tightened unexpectedly, emotion rising in her chest that she did not know how to name. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for indifference, for the cold, calculated existence she assumed awaited any bride sent to this throne. She had not prepared herself for a king who looked at her as though she were something precious, something worth protecting, something worth choosing. I don't know how to trust that, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone in my life who was supposed to care about me made it very clear that I was the last thing worth caring about. Then let me be the first, the king said simply. The silence that followed was different than the silence before, softer somehow, less charged with fear, and more with something fragile and new. Elira did not know what to make of this man, this king who had torn apart every expectation she carried into this room within the span of a single conversation. She did not trust it, not entirely, not yet, but some small, cautious part of her, the same part that had clung to hope through years of neglect and cruelty, allowed itself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, she had not walked into a trap after all. The king called for Mistress Yara to return, and when she did, his tone toward the household keeper had changed entirely from the sharp dismissal of before. See that Lady Elira is given the finest chambers in the east wing, he instructed. The ones overlooking the gardens. I want her attended by our best seamstresses, our best physicians if she requires them, and I want it made clear to every servant in this palace that she is to be treated with the same respect owed to me personally. Anyone who fails to do so will answer to me directly. Mistress Yara's eyes widened slightly, clearly recalculating her earlier assessment of the plain, unassuming girl she had escorted through the palace corridors only an hour before. Of course, Your Majesty, she said, bowing low before turning to Elira with a far softer expression than she had shown earlier. This way, my lady. Elira hesitated, glancing back at the king, uncertain how to end this strange, overwhelming conversation. He inclined his head toward her, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine warmth she had seen cross his face since she arrived. Rest, Elira, he said. There will be time enough for everything else. Tonight, simply rest, and know that you are safe here. I promise you that, whatever else may come. She followed Mistress Yara from the throne room in a daze, her mind spinning with everything the king had told her, everything that contradicted every fear she had carried on the long journey to the capital. The corridors that had seemed so cold and threatening on her arrival now felt different somehow, though she could not have said exactly why, other than the strange, persistent warmth that lingered in her chest from the king's final words. Her new chambers, when they arrived, took her breath away. The room was easily 3 times the size of her entire bedroom back home, with tall windows overlooking gardens bursting with color, even in the fading evening light. A grand bed, draped in soft blue linens, sat against one wall, and a fire already crackled in the hearth, chasing away the evening chill. It was more luxury than Elira had ever imagined for herself, and yet it was not the room itself that left her breathless. It was the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being wanted, of mattering to someone, that followed her through the door and settled somewhere deep inside her chest, refusing to leave. She sat by the window long after Mistress Yara departed, watching the last light fade over the palace gardens, turning the king's words over and over in her mind. Fated mate, a bond that could not be forced or chosen. A king who claimed to care for her within moments of their meeting, who dismissed an entire court simply to speak with her alone, who promised her safety in a voice that sounded, impossibly, like it meant it. She did not know yet whether to believe him. 17 years of neglect had taught her caution above all else. But as she finally climbed into the soft, unfamiliar bed that night, warmer and safer than she had felt in longer than she could remember, Elira allowed herself, just for a moment, to wonder what it might feel like to be truly wanted, and whether this strange, fearsome king might actually be the one to show her. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of Elira's new chambers, warm and golden, chasing away the last traces of a night filled with strange, uneasy dreams. She woke slowly, momentarily forgetting where she was, before the soft blue linens and the unfamiliar grandeur of the room brought the events of the previous day rushing back all at once. A soft knock came at the door before she had even risen from the bed. A young servant girl, perhaps a year or two younger than Alira herself, entered, carrying a tray laden with warm bread, fruit, and a steaming cup of something fragrant and sweet. "Good morning, my lady," the girl said, setting the tray down carefully on a small table near the window. She bobbed a nervous curtsy. "My name is Wren. Mistress Yara assigned me to attend you during your stay." Alira sat up, still adjusting to the strangeness of being waited on, rather than doing the waiting herself. "Thank you, Wren. You didn't need to bring all this." Wren's eyes widened slightly, as though the gratitude itself was unexpected. "The king insisted, my lady. He specifically requested that your breakfast include the honeyed bread from the eastern kitchens. He said it was his favorite as a boy." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Alira's chest at the small, thoughtful detail. It was such a simple gesture, and yet it carried more consideration than she had received from her own family, across nearly 2 decades of living under their roof. She picked at the bread, finding it as delicious as promised, while Wren busied herself laying out a selection of dresses far finer than anything Alira had ever owned. "The king has also arranged for you to walk the gardens this morning, if you wish," Wren continued, glancing at Alira with poorly concealed curiosity. "He said he would join you there himself, once his morning council concludes." Alira's stomach fluttered with something she couldn't quite name, nerves tangled together with a cautious, unfamiliar anticipation. After everything the king had told her the previous evening, after the strange, overwhelming weight of his words about fate and bonds and belonging, she did not know what to expect from him in the light of day, when the drama of the throne room had faded into the quiet ordinariness of morning. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown of pale green from the selection Wren had laid out, still uncomfortable with fabric so fine, it felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. When she finally made her way down to the gardens, guided by a palace servant through corridors she was only beginning to memorize, she found them even more beautiful than they had appeared from her window the night before. Flowering vines climbed along stone archways, and paths wound between beds of roses and lavender, toward a small fountain at the garden's center, where water trickled musically over smooth carved stone. Birds called from the trees lining the garden walls, and for the first time since leaving her family's estate, Alira felt something close to peace settle over her. She was examining a cluster of deep purple flowers she did not recognize when she heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path behind her. She turned to find King Caleb walking toward her, dressed more simply than he had been in the throne room, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he had run his hands through it more than once that morning. "Lady Alira," he said, inclining his head in greeting. Up close, in the honest light of morning, she could see faint shadows beneath his eyes, as though sleep had not come easily to him either. "Your Majesty," she replied, offering a small curtsy out of habit, though he waved the formality away almost immediately. "Please, just Caleb, when we're alone like this," he said. "I've had enough of titles to last several lifetimes." They walked together in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet, and the soft trickle of the fountain, growing louder as they approached it. Alira found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the fierce, commanding king from the throne room with this quieter, more measured version, walking beside her now. "You didn't sleep well," she observed finally, surprising herself with the boldness of the comment. Caleb glanced at her, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. "Is it that obvious? You have shadows under your eyes that weren't there yesterday," she said. "Though I suppose I'm no better. I don't think I slept more than a few hours myself." "I imagine everything I told you yesterday gave you a great deal to think about," he said, his tone gentle, careful, as though he were still uncertain how much weight his words carried with her. "I don't blame you if you found it difficult to believe." Alira considered her answer carefully as they reached the fountain, both of them settling onto a stone bench nearby. "I want to believe you," she admitted. "That's the strange part. Everything in me wants to trust what you said, and that frightens me more than if I didn't believe you at all." Caleb turned to face her fully, his amber eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why does it frighten you?" "Because I've spent my whole life learning not to trust kindness," she said quietly. "In my family, kindness was always temporary, always conditional, always followed by disappointment. If I let myself believe you, and I'm wrong, I don't know how I'll survive that. Something in Caleb's expression shifted, softened, as though her honesty had reached somewhere deep and unguarded within him. I cannot promise you that I'll never disappoint you, he said slowly. I'm not perfect, and I carry my own scars from my own family, scars that shaped me into someone the entire kingdom fears. But I can promise you this: whatever comes, I will never treat you the way your family treated you. You will never again be the daughter no one wants in my presence. Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of Alira's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let them fall in front of him. You barely know me, she whispered. I know enough, Caleb said. I know that you walked into that throne room yesterday expecting cruelty, and instead of falling apart, you stood straighter. I know that even after everything your family did to you, you still speak of your younger brother with such tenderness that I could hear it in your voice. I know that the bond chose you, and whatever else I don't yet understand about you, I trust that choice completely. They sat together by the fountain for a long while after that, talking of smaller things, easier things. Caleb told her about his own difficult childhood, about a father who ruled with an iron fist and taught him that strength was the only language worth speaking, about a mother who died when he was young, leaving him to navigate the brutal politics of the court alone from an early age. Alira found herself opening up in turn, sharing memories of her grandmother, the only person in her family who had ever shown her real warmth, and of Tobias, the younger brother she missed more with each passing hour away from home. By the time the sun climbed high overhead, something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable, the careful distance of strangers giving way to something warmer, something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of friendship. I have council matters to attend this afternoon, Caleb said reluctantly, as they finally rose from the bench, but I would like to dine with you this evening, if you're willing. I'd like that, Alira said, and found that she meant it entirely. As the days that followed unfolded, a rhythm began to form between them. Mornings in the garden, evenings sharing meals in a smaller, more private dining room than the grand hall Alira had glimpsed on her arrival. Caleb was patient with her, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, always careful to let her set the pace of whatever was growing between them. He asked about her interests, discovered she loved reading, and had rarely been permitted access to her family's small library, and within days, a personal collection of books began appearing in her chambers, gifts left without fanfare, without expectation of anything in return. Alira found herself, despite every instinct telling her to remain guarded, slowly beginning to trust him. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, trusting someone, and she examined it cautiously each day, waiting for the moment it would prove to be a mistake, the way every other instance of trust in her life had eventually proven to be. But that moment did not come. Instead, each day brought small, quiet proof that Caleb meant what he said, that his kindness was not conditional, that his patience did not have a hidden price waiting to be revealed. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, they sat together on the balcony outside her chambers, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink over the palace gardens. Caleb had grown quieter than usual that evening, his expression thoughtful, almost troubled. What is it? Alira asked, noticing the shift in him. He hesitated before answering. The council has begun to notice how much time I spend with you, he said. Some of them are pleased, hoping it will finally secure the succession they've pressed me about for years. Others are less pleased. There are old families in this court who resent that a girl from a minor noble house has captured the attention of the crown so completely, especially one whose own family showed such little regard for her. Alira's stomach tightened with unease. Do you think that will be a problem? I think, Caleb said carefully, that some people in this court are used to getting what they want, through manipulation and cruelty, and they will not appreciate someone new, upsetting the balance they've grown comfortable with. I want you to be aware of that, not to frighten you, but because I meant what I said about protecting you. If anyone in this palace ever treats you with anything less than the respect you deserve, I need you to tell me immediately. Alira nodded, though a small seed of worry had planted itself in her chest, one that would not fully leave her in the days that followed. She thought of her sisters, of the calculating way they had always maneuvered for advantage within their own family, and wondered whether the court held similar dangers, dressed in finer clothing but no less cruel underneath. "I'm not afraid," she said, and found that, mostly, it was true. Whatever challenges awaited her in this new life, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing them. For the first time since her family had sent her away like an unwanted burden, she had someone standing beside her who seemed genuinely determined to see her safe, seen, and valued. Caleb reached over and took her hand gently in his, the first deliberate touch between them since her arrival. His fingers were warm, careful, as though he were handling something precious. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "you will not face it alone. That much I can promise you completely." As the sun finished its descent below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, Elira allowed herself to lean, just slightly, into the warmth of his presence beside her, unaware that far beyond the palace walls, in a modest house she had once called home, her sisters had already begun plotting how to reclaim what they believed rightfully belonged to them, and that the fragile peace she had found in this strange new life was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Word of the king's growing attachment to Elira spread through the palace like wildfire, and it did not take long for that fire to reach the drawing room of the Voss family estate, carried by a merchant who had recently returned from the capital with tales of the strange favor shown to the family's forgotten daughter. Ophelia Voss set down her teacup so abruptly that it rattled against its saucer, tea sloshing over the rim. "Say that again," she demanded, staring at the merchant with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning fury. "It's the talk of the capital, my lady," the merchant said, clearly enjoying the attention his gossip had earned him. "The king dismissed the entire court the moment your sister walked into the throne room. Gave her the finest chambers in the East Wing. They say he visits her every morning in the gardens, that he's had books and gifts sent to her rooms daily. Some are even whispering he means to make her his queen, not just a bride of convenience." Marisol, seated near the window with her embroidery forgotten in her lap, exchanged a sharp look with her sister. "That's impossible," she said. "Elira? Our Elira?" The king wouldn't look twice at her. "Apparently he has," the merchant said with a shrug, before excusing himself to spread the news elsewhere, leaving the two sisters alone with a silence that grew heavier by the second. "This is a mistake," Ophelia said finally, rising from her chair to pace the length of the room, her earlier composure cracking into something colder, sharper. She was supposed to disappear quietly, the way the others did. Instead, she's being treated like royalty, while we sit here in this crumbling estate, watching our own prospects grow thinner by the season. "Perhaps it's simply pity," Marisol offered, though her voice lacked conviction. "The king feels sorry for her, given how plainly she arrived. It will pass." "And if it doesn't," Ophelia snapped, "if she becomes his queen, Marisol, do you understand what that means? Our family's disgraced, unwanted daughter, elevated above us. Everyone in this kingdom knows how we treated her. If she rises high enough, if she ever decides to speak of what our parents did, we could lose everything. Our marriages, our standing, everything we've worked to secure." The color drained from Marisol's face as the full weight of the possibility settled over her. She thought of her upcoming marriage to the merchant's son, a match that depended entirely on her family's reputation remaining untarnished. If word spread that the Voss family had cruelly discarded their own daughter, sending her away as an unwanted burden while favoring the sisters who tormented her, the merchant's family would certainly reconsider the engagement. "We have to do something," Marisol said quietly. Ophelia's eyes narrowed with calculating intensity. "We do, and I know exactly where to start." Within days, Ophelia had arranged for a young woman named Hesse, a distant cousin on their mother's side with a talent for charm and deception, to travel to the capital under the guise of seeking employment within the palace household. Hesse had grown up alongside Elira's family, had witnessed firsthand the sisters' casual cruelty toward their younger sibling, and held no particular affection for Elira herself, making her the perfect instrument for Ophelia's plan. "You understand what needs to happen," Ophelia instructed during their final meeting before Hesse's departure. "Get close to her, gain her trust if you can, and find a way to make certain this ridiculous royal favor does not last. If she falls from grace on her own, so much the better." If she requires a small push in that direction, I trust you'll know how to provide it." Hessa smiled thinly, understanding perfectly well what was being asked of her, without either woman needing to speak the darker implications aloud. "Consider it done." Meanwhile, within the palace, Illyra remained blissfully unaware of the scheme taking shape against her, her days continuing to unfold in the same gentle rhythm that had slowly begun to heal wounds she had carried for years. Caleb's attentiveness had not wavered in the weeks since her arrival, and if anything, had only deepened as they grew more comfortable in each other's company. One afternoon, as they walked together through the palace library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling, with towering shelves of books that made Illyra's breath catch every time she entered, Caleb turned to her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost nervous beneath his usual composure. "I want to ask you something," he said, guiding her toward a quiet alcove near one of the tall windows. Illyra's heart quickened, though she could not have said whether from anticipation or nerves. "What is it?" "The council has been pressing me about the succession for years," Caleb began, choosing his words carefully. "Traditionally, a king announces his intended queen within the first month of a bride's arrival at court. I've resisted that pressure until now, because none of the previous arrangements ever felt right to me. But you are different, Illyra. I knew that the moment you walked into my throne room, and every day since has only confirmed it." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. "I don't want to rush you, and if you need more time, I will give you as much time as you require. But I want you to know that my intention, when you're ready, is to make you my queen, not simply my bride, but my equal in every sense the crown allows." Illyra's breath caught in her throat, emotions swelling so suddenly and completely that she struggled to find words. 17 years of being told she was worthless, unwanted, a burden to be discarded at the first opportunity, and here stood a king, a man the entire kingdom feared, offering her not just safety, but genuine partnership, genuine equality, genuine love. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to say anything yet," Caleb said gently. "I only wanted you to know my intentions clearly, so that whatever choice you make it with full understanding of what I'm offering." Illyra studied his face, searching for any trace of the cruelty the rumors had once painted him with, and found nothing but sincerity, patience, and something that looked, unmistakably, like love beginning to bloom. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm ready to stop being afraid of what this could become." Caleb's expression softened into something achingly tender, and for the first time since her arrival, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, careful, reverent, as though she were something precious he intended to protect for the rest of his life. "Then we'll take the next steps together," he said, "whatever they may be." It was 2 days later that Hessa arrived at the palace, presenting herself to Mistress Yara as a distant relation of Lady Illyra's, seeking a position within the household as a personal attendant. Mistress Yara, unaware of the family history simmering beneath Hessa's polite request, saw only an opportunity to provide Illyra with a familiar face from home, and arranged for Hessa to join Ren in attending to Illyra's daily needs. Illyra's initial reaction to seeing Hessa was one of cautious surprise rather than warmth. She had known Hessa only distantly growing up, aware of the family connection, but never particularly close, given how rarely their families visited one another. "Hessa," Illyra said, genuinely startled to find her among the new household staff. "What are you doing here?" "I heard of your good fortune," Hessa said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, "and thought perhaps you could use a familiar face among all these strangers. I hope you don't mind." Illyra, starved for any connection to home despite everything her family had done to her, found herself cautiously grateful for the familiar presence, unaware of the true purpose behind Hessa's sudden appearance. Over the following days, Hessa proved herself attentive and helpful, gradually earning small measures of Illyra's trust through carefully calculated kindness and apparent interest in her well-being. It was during one of their private conversations, nearly a week into Hessa's employment, that the seeds of doubt began to take root. "You seem so happy here," Hessa observed one evening as she helped Illyra prepare for bed, brushing out her hair with practiced, gentle strokes. "I'm glad, truly, though I admit I worry for you a little." Worry? Alira asked, glancing at Hessa's reflection in the mirror before her. Why? Only that court life can be complicated, Hessa said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision. The king has had brides before you, after all. I've heard some of the older servants whisper that his interest, however genuine it seems now, has a way of cooling once the initial fascination fades. I simply don't want to see you hurt, given everything you've already endured. The words settled into Alira's chest like small stones, not enough to shatter the trust she had built with Caleb over the past weeks, but enough to plant a quiet, nagging worry that had not existed before. She thought of the 3 brides who had come before her, of Caleb's explanation that the arrangements had simply never developed into anything real, and told herself firmly that her situation was different, that what she and Caleb shared was not the same as those failed political matches. But the seed had been planted, and over the following days, Hessa continued to water it with small, carefully placed comments, subtle enough that Alira never suspected deliberate manipulation, each one designed to erode her confidence in Caleb's affection, just slightly, just enough to make her doubt what she had begun to believe was real. Alira found herself, despite her best efforts, growing quieter during her mornings with Caleb, watching him with a more guarded eye than she had in weeks, searching for signs of the cooling interest Hessa had warned her about. Caleb, sensing the shift in her demeanor but unaware of its source, grew increasingly concerned, though he did not press her, respecting the space she seemed to need. It was this growing distance, subtle but unmistakable, that Hessa reported back to Ophelia through carefully worded letters smuggled out of the palace, and it was this distance that convinced Ophelia her plan was working exactly as intended. But a small crack of doubt was not enough to satisfy her family's ambitions, not with so much at stake, and within the shadows of the palace, a far more dangerous scheme was already beginning to take shape, one that would test not only Alira's fragile trust in Caleb, but her very safety within the walls that had begun to feel, for the first time in her life, like home. The distance between Alira and Caleb grew wider with each passing day, though neither of them spoke openly about the cause. Alira found herself second-guessing every kind word, every gentle touch, wondering if Hessa's warnings held some truth she was too inexperienced to recognize. Caleb, meanwhile, grew increasingly troubled by the shift in her, uncertain what had changed, but determined not to push her into revealing something she wasn't ready to share. It was during a quiet evening in the palace library, the same alcove where he had once spoken of his intentions to make her his queen, that Caleb finally broke the silence between them. Something has changed, he said, setting aside the book he had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour. You've grown distant, Alira, and I don't understand why. If I've done something to upset you, I need you to tell me, because I cannot fix what I don't understand. Alira hesitated, torn between her growing unease and the genuine affection she still felt for him beneath the doubt Hessa had planted. I've heard things, she admitted finally, unable to hold the words back any longer. About the brides who came before me. About how your interest seemed genuine with them too, at first, before it faded. Caleb's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, confusion giving way to something sharper, more focused. Who told you that? It doesn't matter, Alira said, though her voice wavered slightly. It matters a great deal, Caleb said, his tone firm but not unkind. Alira, I told you the truth about those arrangements. I never felt anything toward those women, not affection, not the beginnings of affection, nothing. There was no fading interest because there was never any interest to begin with. Whoever told you otherwise is either mistaken or deliberately trying to create doubt between us. The certainty in his voice, combined with the genuine hurt visible in his eyes at the suggestion he might have deceived her, chipped away at the doubt Hessa's words had built. I'm sorry, Alira said softly. I didn't mean to doubt you. It's just, I've spent my whole life being disappointed by people I trusted. It's hard to unlearn that, even when I want to. Caleb reached for her hand, his expression softening with understanding. I know, he said, and I won't pretend that healing from that kind of pain happens quickly, but I need you to bring these doubts to me directly, Alira, not let them fester in silence. We cannot build something real if we're not honest with each other, even when honesty is uncomfortable. She nodded, feeling foolish for allowing Hessa's careful comments to create such distance between them, and resolved to be more direct in the future, though she said nothing yet about Hessa's role in planting the seeds of doubt, still uncertain whether her cousin's intentions had truly been malicious or simply misguided concern. That uncertainty would not last much longer. 3 nights later, Illyra woke in the darkest hours before dawn to the sound of raised voices echoing from somewhere within the palace corridors. She rose from her bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and crept to her door, pressing her ear against the wood to make out the commotion beyond. "Found in her chambers, unmistakable evidence," a voice was saying, low and urgent. "The king must be informed immediately," another voice replied. Illyra's stomach dropped with dread. She opened her door carefully to find 2 palace guards standing in the corridor, their expressions grim, along with Mistress Yara, whose usually composed face had gone pale with alarm. "My lady," Mistress Yara said, startled to find Illyra awake. "You should return to your chambers. This doesn't concern you." "What's happened?" Illyra demanded, an instinctive dread already coiling in her chest. Mistress Yara hesitated, exchanging a glance with the guards before answering. "There has been a discovery, my lady. Documents found hidden within the East Wing, correspondence suggesting a plot against the crown. I'm afraid the evidence points toward your chambers." The words hit Illyra like a physical blow. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising with panic. "I would never conspire against Caleb, against the king. I don't understand how anything like that could be found in my rooms." "The king has been informed," one of the guards said stiffly. "He's ordered that you be brought to the throne room immediately." Illyra's legs felt unsteady beneath her, as she was escorted through the dark corridors, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. She had done nothing wrong, had given no one reason to suspect her of any wrongdoing, and yet the guards' grim expressions and Mistress Yara's evident distress made clear that whatever evidence had been discovered was damning enough to warrant immediate action. The throne room, when they arrived, was already filling with members of the court, roused from their beds by the commotion, their faces alight with curiosity and barely concealed excitement at the prospect of scandal. Caleb stood near his throne, his expression harder and more controlled than Illyra had seen since her arrival, though his eyes softened with visible relief the moment they found her among the guards escorting her forward. "Bring the evidence forward," Caleb commanded, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring court instantly. An older man Illyra recognized vaguely as one of the palace's chief advisors stepped forward, holding a small bundle of papers. "These were discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Lady Illyra's chambers, Your Majesty. Letters detailing a plot to poison you during the upcoming harvest festival, along with correspondence suggesting collaboration with foreign agents seeking to destabilize the crown." Gasps rippled through the assembled court. Illyra felt the blood drain from her face, her whole body trembling with the sheer impossibility of the accusation. "I've never seen those papers in my life," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I would never do anything to harm Caleb. You have to believe me." Caleb's gaze had not left her since she entered the room, and something in his expression, steady and unwavering despite the chaos around them, gave her the smallest measure of hope. "Bring the letters to me," he said. The advisor complied, and Caleb examined the papers carefully, his jaw tightening as he read through them. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from careful control to something far colder, far more dangerous. "These letters are forgeries," he said flatly. The court erupted into startled murmurs. The advisor who had presented the evidence looked genuinely baffled. "Your Majesty, the handwriting appears consistent with samples of Lady Illyra's correspondence. And the seal? The handwriting is a skilled imitation, and the seal was clearly pressed with a duplicate rather than an original." Caleb interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room's growing chaos. "I have studied Illyra's handwriting closely over these past weeks. This is not her hand, however carefully it has been copied. Someone within this palace has fabricated this evidence." He turned to the guards who had escorted Illyra into the room. "Who discovered these documents?" The guards exchanged an uneasy glance before one of them answered. "A servant reported the hiding place, Your Majesty. A young woman named Hessa, recently employed as Lady Illyra's attendant." Something dark and dangerous flickered across Caleb's features at the name. Bring her here immediately. It did not take long for guards to locate Hessa, who was discovered attempting to slip out through a servant's entrance near the palace stables, a small satchel of belongings already packed, as though she had anticipated the need for a hasty departure. When she was brought before the throne, her earlier composure had cracked entirely, replaced by visible panic. "I want the truth," Caleb said, his voice deceptively calm in a way that seemed to unsettle Hessa far more than shouting might have. "Who orchestrated this plot?" Hessa's eyes darted around the room, searching for some avenue of escape that did not exist. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with fear. "Lady Ophelia," she admitted. "Elira's sister. She sent me here to undermine her standing with the crown. The letters, the doubts I planted between you both, all of it was arranged from the start." Elira felt the room tilt slightly around her, betrayal settling into her chest with a familiar, aching weight. Even here, even now, her own family had reached across the distance to try to destroy the fragile happiness she had found. She should have expected it, perhaps, given everything she knew of her sister's capacity for cruelty, but the depth of the scheme still struck her with unexpected pain. "You planted the doubts," Elira said quietly, looking at Hessa with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "About the king's past brides. About his affection fading. That was never genuine concern at all." Hessa said nothing, her silence confirming everything Elira needed to know. Caleb's fury, barely contained beneath his controlled exterior, seemed to fill the entire throne room with a palpable tension. "You will be held for formal questioning regarding the full extent of this conspiracy," he said to Hessa, his voice cold and final. "And you will provide every detail of Lady Ophelia's involvement, or you will face the full consequences of treason alone." As guards led Hessa away, weeping and pleading for leniency, Caleb turned to Elira, his expression softening entirely from the cold authority he had shown moments before. He crossed the distance between them quickly, taking her trembling hands in his own. "I should have protected you from this," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "I should have questioned Hessa's presence here more carefully, given the family she came from." "You couldn't have known," Elira said, though her voice still shook with the aftermath of fear and betrayal. "I didn't even suspect her myself, not fully, not until now." "It won't happen again," Caleb said fiercely, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I promise you that. Whoever comes for you, whether from your family or from within this court, they will answer to me directly. You are not alone in facing this, Elira, not anymore, and not ever again." As the assembled court watched, whispering amongst themselves at the raw devotion visible in their king's expression, Elira felt something settle within her chest, a fragile but growing certainty that whatever her family attempted next, she finally had someone standing firmly beside her, someone whose protection was not conditional, not temporary, not dependent on her being convenient or useful. She did not yet know how far her sisters were willing to go to reclaim what they believed they were owed, but for the first time since arriving at the palace, she understood with complete clarity that she would not face whatever came next without Caleb standing directly at her side. The interrogation of Hessa continued through the following days, conducted under Caleb's direct oversight, and with each session, the full scope of Ophelia's scheme became clearer. Letters were recovered from Hessa's belongings, written in Ophelia's own hand, detailing instructions for the forged documents, the timing of their planting, and explicit orders to ensure Elira's standing with the crown was destroyed by any means necessary. Caleb read through the letters in his private study, his expression darkening further with each page, while Elira sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to reconcile the sister she had grown up with against the calculated cruelty revealed in the correspondence. "She wanted me destroyed," Elira said quietly, staring at nothing in particular. "Not just embarrassed or sent home in disgrace. She wanted me formally charged with treason. She wanted me executed, Caleb." "She will not succeed," Caleb said firmly, setting the letters aside. "But I need to understand something, Elira. Was there always this much venom between you and your sisters, or has something changed since you left home?" Elira considered the question carefully, memories surfacing that she had spent years trying to bury. "There was always cruelty," she admitted. "Small things, mostly." Being excluded, being blamed, being reminded constantly that I was the disappointment among us. But this is different. This is calculated in a way that frightens me more than anything they ever did while I lived under their roof. I believe it's because you're no longer within their reach, Caleb said thoughtfully. As long as you lived at home, they could control you, diminish you, keep you exactly where they wanted you. Now that you're here, valued and protected, you represent something they cannot control, and worse, something that threatens the image they've carefully constructed for themselves. If word spreads of how they treated you, their own prospects, their own marriages, their own standing within noble society, all of it becomes vulnerable. The realization settled over Alira with uncomfortable clarity. Her sisters had never valued her for who she was, only for what her absence or her disgrace could provide them. Even now, even after everything, she remained useful to them only as a threat to be neutralized. "What happens now?" she asked. Caleb's expression hardened with resolve. "Now, I summon your family to court, all of them. I want them to answer for what they've done, not just to you tonight, but across every year of your life that they chose cruelty over the love a family owes its children." Alira felt a flicker of apprehension at the thought of facing her family again, of standing before them not as the discarded daughter they remembered, but as someone protected, someone valued, someone with the full weight of the crown behind her, part of her, the part still shaped by years of conditioning, worried what it would mean to confront them directly. But a larger part, the part that had begun to heal under Caleb's steady care, felt something closer to readiness than fear. "I want to face them," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I want them to see what they threw away." Caleb's expression softened with unmistakable pride. "Then we'll summon them together." The summons was sent within days, delivered by royal messenger to the Voss family estate, with instructions to appear before the crown within a fortnight to answer formal charges related to conspiracy against the throne. The letter did not name Ophelia specifically, allowing the full family to arrive uncertain of exactly what awaited them, uncertain whether the summons concerned Alira's welfare or something far more dangerous to their own standing. In the days leading up to their arrival, Alira found herself preparing in ways that went beyond simply choosing what to wear. She spent hours in quiet reflection, sometimes alone in the palace gardens, sometimes in conversation with Caleb, working through years of buried resentment and pain that she had never allowed herself to fully examine while living under her family's roof. "I keep thinking about all the moments I stayed silent," she confided to Caleb one evening as they walked together beneath the stars. "All the times I absorbed their cruelty without pushing back, telling myself it was easier, safer, to simply endure it. I don't know if I even remember how to confront them directly." "You don't have to have all the words prepared perfectly," Caleb said gently. "Whatever you say, whatever you feel in that moment, will be enough. And you won't be standing there alone, Alira. Whatever happens, I will be right beside you." That promise carried her through the anxious days that followed, and when the royal messenger finally returned word that the Voss family carriage had arrived at the palace gates, Alira found herself standing straighter than she had in years, her chin lifted in the same manner her grandmother had once taught her, ready to face whatever confrontation awaited. The throne room was full when the Voss family was finally escorted inside, every member of the court present, drawn by rumors of the unfolding scandal that had gripped palace gossip for the better part of 2 weeks. Alira stood beside Caleb's throne, not seated among the court as a mere observer, but positioned prominently at the king's side, a placement that immediately signaled to everyone present, including her family, exactly how far her standing had risen since her arrival. Her father entered first, his face pale and drawn, clearly having grasped by now the seriousness of what awaited them. Her mother followed, her usual composure cracking visibly at the sight of Alira standing so prominently beside the throne, dressed in fine silk rather than the plain traveling dress she had departed in weeks earlier. Marisol trailed behind, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes darted nervously toward her mother for guidance. Ophelia entered last, and despite the evident fear beneath her expression, she still carried herself with the same haughty confidence Alira remembered from years of enduring her sister's casual cruelty. "You stand before this court," Caleb began, his voice carrying easily through the silent throne room, accused of conspiracy to defraud the crown, and more specifically, of conspiring to falsely implicate Lady Alira Voss in a plot of treason against my person. Gasps rippled through the assembled nobility, many of whom had not yet heard the full details of the scandal that had gripped palace gossip. Alira watched her mother's face drain of color, watched her father's hands begin to tremble, watched Marisol's composure finally crack into open fear. Only Ophelia remained defiant, though even she could not entirely mask the panic beginning to show in her eyes. "We know nothing of any conspiracy," her father said quickly, his voice pleading. "Your Majesty, surely you understand. We would never—" "The evidence has already been thoroughly examined," Caleb interrupted, his tone leaving no room for further denial. "Hessa, a distant relation employed within this household under false pretenses, has confessed in full detail to receiving direct instructions from Lady Ophelia to fabricate documents implicating Lady Alira in treason. We have Lady Ophelia's own correspondence confirming these instructions in her own hand." Every eye in the room turned toward Ophelia, whose defiant composure finally began to crumble under the weight of the gathered court's scrutiny. "I only wanted to protect our family's reputation," she said, her voice rising with desperate justification. "Alira was never meant to matter, Your Majesty. She was sent here as a formality, nothing more. Instead, she's paraded before the entire kingdom as though she's worth something, and our own family suffers for it. Our own prospects diminished by comparison." "Enough," Caleb said, his voice cutting through her words like a blade, quiet, but absolutely commanding. The entire throne room fell into immediate, tense silence. He rose from his throne then, standing tall and imposing, and turned toward Alira, with an expression of such open tenderness that it stood in stark contrast to the cold authority he had just directed at her sister. "This is Lady Alira Voss," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "My fated mate, chosen not by politics or convenience, but by a bond older than this crown itself. She is worth more to me, and to this kingdom, than any title or fortune your family has ever possessed. And the fact that you cannot see her value after everything she has endured says far more about your own character than it ever could about hers." He extended a hand toward Alira, and she stepped forward to stand beside him, facing her family directly for the first time since the summons had been issued. She looked at her mother, at her father, at Marisol's frightened silence, and finally at Ophelia's crumbling defiance, and found that the fear she had once carried in their presence had quietly, completely dissolved. "I spent 17 years believing I was worthless," Alira said, her voice steady and clear despite the weight of the moment. "I spent 17 years absorbing every cruelty you offered, telling myself it was simply my place in this family, that I had no right to expect better. I know now that I was wrong. I was never worthless. I was simply surrounded by people too blinded by their own cruelty to see any value beyond what could be extracted for their own gain." Her mother opened her mouth as though to protest, but no words came. Alira continued, years of buried pain finally finding their voice. "You called me trash," she said, looking directly at her mother now. "You sacrificed me without a second thought, believing I would never be missed, believing my absence would cost this family nothing. And when it became clear that I had found something here, something real, something you could never offer me, your response was not joy for my well-being, but jealousy so consuming that you were willing to see me executed for treason, rather than accept that I might finally have found the place I was always meant to be." The throne room remained utterly silent, every noble present transfixed by the raw honesty of her words, by the quiet dignity with which she delivered them. Caleb stepped forward then, his presence a steady, protective force beside her. "The council will determine appropriate consequences for Lady Ophelia's conspiracy in the coming days," he announced to the room at large. "As for the rest of the Voss family, know this. Whatever standing you believed your daughter's absence would preserve for you has been permanently altered by your own actions here today. The kingdom will remember how you treated the woman who now stands as my chosen mate, and you will live with the consequences of that reputation for the remainder of your lives." As guards moved forward to escort the stunned, silent family from the throne room, Ophelia struggling weakly against their grip, while her parents walked with the hollow, defeated posture of people who finally understood the full weight of what they had lost, Alira remained standing beside Caleb, watching the family that had once defined her entire sense of worth disappear from her life. This time not because she had been discarded, but because she had finally, completely, reclaimed her own value beyond anything they had ever been capable of offering her. The days following the confrontation with the Voss family brought a strange, unsettled quiet to the palace. Ophelia remained held within the palace's secure quarters, awaiting formal judgment from the royal council, while the rest of her family had departed under a cloud of public disgrace that showed no signs of lifting. Elira expected, perhaps naively, that with her family's scheme exposed and punished, the danger surrounding her had finally passed. She was wrong. The trouble began quietly, the way most dangerous things do, with a conversation Elira overheard entirely by accident. She had gone to the library one afternoon, seeking a particular book Caleb had recommended, and found herself pausing behind a tall shelf when she recognized voices drifting from the reading alcove beyond. "The Hollis family has always expected the match to go to Lady Priscilla," one voice was saying, low and conspiratorial. "For years, everyone assumed the king's marriage would secure an alliance with House Hollis. Now this outsider arrives, and suddenly the succession is thrown into chaos." "Lord Garrick will not accept it quietly," another voice replied. "He's already spoken with several council members about contesting the legitimacy of this so-called bond. Fated mates indeed. Convenient timing, don't you think, for the king to suddenly discover such devotion toward an unknown noble's daughter?" Elira's blood ran cold as she listened, understanding with sudden clarity that her family's scheme had not been the only threat lurking within the palace walls. She remained frozen behind the shelf until the voices faded away, then hurried to find Caleb, her heart pounding with newfound dread. She found him in his private study, reviewing documents with his chief advisor, and the moment she entered, her expression alone was enough to make him rise immediately from his chair. "What's happened?" he asked, crossing the room to her side. She recounted the overheard conversation as steadily as she could manage, watching Caleb's expression darken with each detail. His advisor, an older man named Corwin, who had served the crown for decades, exchanged a grave look with the king. "Lord Garrick Hollis has long harbored ambitions of securing his family's position through marriage to the throne," Corwin said carefully. "His daughter Priscilla was considered a strong candidate before Lady Elira's arrival. I had hoped his disappointment would fade with time, but it seems his patience has run thinner than I anticipated." "How serious is the threat?" Caleb asked, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Serious enough that I recommend increased caution," Corwin said. "Lord Garrick holds considerable influence among the council, and if he believes he can discredit the bond between you and Lady Elira, he may attempt more than simply spreading doubt through court gossip." Caleb turned to Elira, taking her hands in his with an urgency she had not seen from him since the night Hessa's conspiracy had been uncovered. "I want additional guards assigned to you immediately," he said, "and I want you to avoid moving through the palace alone until we better understand what Lord Garrick intends." Elira nodded, though a familiar knot of anxiety had settled deep in her stomach. Just when she had begun to believe the worst danger had passed, a new threat had emerged, one born not from her own family's jealousy, but from the tangled politics of a court she was only beginning to understand. Over the following days, Caleb's caution proved well-founded. Small, unsettling incidents began to accumulate. A vase of flowers delivered to Elira's chambers arrived containing blooms known to cause severe illness if ingested, discovered only because an alert servant recognized the plant before it could be brewed into tea, as instructed by a forged note claiming to be from Caleb himself. A loose stone was found deliberately dislodged along a garden path Elira frequently walked, positioned precisely where an unsuspecting foot might catch and send her tumbling down a steep embankment. Each incident on its own might have been dismissed as accident or coincidence, but together they painted a clear and disturbing pattern, one that Caleb refused to ignore. "These are not the actions of a man simply frustrated by lost political opportunity," he said grimly, examining the report detailing the poisonous flowers. "This is someone attempting to eliminate you entirely, disguising the attempts as accidents, to avoid direct suspicion falling on themselves." "Do you believe it's truly Lord Garrick?" Elira asked, seated across from him in his private study, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she had barely touched. "I believe it's likely, Caleb said. "But belief is not proof, and I will not move against a member of the council without absolute certainty. Accusing him falsely would create exactly the kind of division within the court that would weaken the crown at a moment when we can least afford weakness." Alira found herself growing increasingly anxious as the days passed. The constant presence of additional guards a persistent reminder that danger still lurked somewhere within the palace walls, patient and calculating, waiting for an opportunity that had not yet presented itself. She began to notice Lord Garrick himself during formal court gatherings, a tall, silver-haired man whose polite smiles never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes whenever they landed on her. The true crisis arrived on the evening of a formal banquet held to celebrate the autumn harvest, an event that drew nearly every noble family in the kingdom to the palace for an evening of feasting and courtly display. Alira had grown more comfortable navigating these gatherings over the preceding weeks, but something about the atmosphere that evening felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension she could not quite name. She had stepped away from the main hall briefly, seeking a moment of quiet in one of the smaller adjoining chambers, when she became aware of a presence behind her. She turned to find Lord Garrick himself standing near the doorway, his expression carrying none of the polite warmth he displayed during formal gatherings. "Lady Alira," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath its courtesy. "I wondered if we might speak privately." Every instinct in Alira's body screamed danger, the accumulated weight of weeks of near misses and quiet threats, crystallizing into immediate, visceral alarm. "I should return to the banquet," she said carefully, moving toward the door, though Lord Garrick shifted his position slightly, subtly blocking her path without appearing overtly threatening to any casual observer. "Just a moment of your time," he said, his tone still deceptively pleasant. "I merely wish to offer some friendly advice. Court life can be treacherous for those unaccustomed to its currents. It would be a shame if your unfamiliarity with our ways led to some unfortunate accident." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them, and Alira felt her heart pounding hard against her ribs, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "Is that a warning, my lord, or a confession?" Something flickered across Lord Garrick's expression, surprise perhaps at her boldness, quickly replaced by a colder, more dangerous calculation. "Simply advice," he said, "given freely, from one who understands how quickly favor at court can shift, how easily an outsider might find herself unable to withstand its pressures." Before Alira could respond, the door behind Lord Garrick opened, and Caleb entered the chamber, his amber eyes immediately sharpening with dangerous focus as he took in the scene before him, Alira's tense posture, Lord Garrick's positioning that placed him between her and the exit. "Lord Garrick," Caleb said, his voice deceptively calm, though Alira could see the barely contained fury simmering just beneath his controlled exterior. "I wasn't aware you and Lady Alira were acquainted well enough for private conversation." "Merely offering welcome to court, Your Majesty," Lord Garrick said smoothly, though his composure had visibly faltered at Caleb's sudden appearance. "Nothing more." Caleb crossed the room in several long strides, positioning himself deliberately between Alira and Lord Garrick, his presence radiating a protective intensity that seemed to fill the entire chamber. "I think," he said, his voice low and carrying an edge that made even Alira's skin prickle with awareness of something dangerous lurking beneath his controlled exterior, "that we should discuss this matter further, Lord Garrick, privately. In my study, immediately." Lord Garrick's confident composure cracked visibly at the command, understanding perhaps that whatever careful denials he had prepared would not withstand the scrutiny Caleb intended to apply. As guards moved to escort him from the chamber at Caleb's silent signal, Alira remained rooted in place, her heart still racing from the tense confrontation, watching the man who had haunted the palace's shadows for weeks, finally being led away toward whatever reckoning awaited him. Caleb turned to her immediately, his controlled fury giving way to visible concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gently cupping her face as he searched her expression for any sign of harm. "I'm fine," Alira said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of fear. "He didn't touch me, he only implied things, warnings, threats, dressed up as friendly advice." "That's enough," Caleb said grimly. "Combined with everything else, the poisoned flowers, the dislodged stone, This confrontation gives us more than sufficient grounds to investigate his involvement fully. Whatever careful denials he's prepared, I intend to uncover the complete truth tonight." As he guided her from the chamber, one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, Elira felt the lingering fear of the confrontation slowly giving way to something steadier, something that had become familiar in the weeks since her arrival at the palace. Whatever threats emerged from the shadows of court politics, whatever enemies revealed themselves determined to see her fail or worse, she no longer faced them from a place of powerlessness. She had a protector now, fierce and unwavering, and as they walked together back toward the banquet hall, she found herself trusting completely that whatever truth Caleb uncovered that night, justice would follow swiftly and surely in its wake. Lord Garrick Hollis sat rigid in a chair within Caleb's private study, flanked by 2 guards, his earlier composure entirely stripped away under the weight of the king's unwavering scrutiny. Elira remained nearby, seated in a corner of the room at Caleb's insistence, close enough to witness the confrontation, but positioned safely away from any potential danger. "I will ask you once more," Caleb said, his voice carrying a coldness Elira had never heard from him before, sharp enough to make even the seasoned guards flanking Lord Garrick shift uneasily. "Were you responsible for the poisoned flowers delivered to Lady Elira's chambers?" "I have already told you, Your Majesty. I know nothing of any poisoned flowers," Lord Garrick said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the confidence his words attempted to convey. Caleb leaned forward slowly, his amber eyes catching the candlelight in a way that made them appear almost luminous, and for the first time since she had known him, Elira caught a glimpse of something beneath his composed exterior that reminded her sharply of the old stories, the whispered warnings about wolf blood and ancient bonds. A low, barely audible growl seemed to rumble beneath his words as he spoke. "I can smell deception, Lord Garrick," Caleb said quietly. "It has a particular scent, sharp and bitter, quite different from truth. You are lying to me, and every moment you continue this pretense only deepens the consequences you will face when the full truth emerges regardless." Lord Garrick's face paled visibly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with white-knuckled tension. For a long moment, silence filled the study, broken only by the crackling fire in the hearth. Then, finally, something in his resolve seemed to crumble entirely. "It was never meant to kill her," he said, his voice cracking with something between fear and desperate justification. "Only to frighten her badly enough that she might reconsider her position here, might choose to return home rather than risk further danger. I never intended lasting harm, only persuasion." "Persuasion," Caleb repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "You attempted to poison the woman I intend to make my queen, and you call it persuasion." "You must understand, Your Majesty," Lord Garrick pressed on, desperation lending urgency to his words. "For years, the council anticipated a match between yourself and House Hollis. My daughter Priscilla was raised specifically with this expectation, educated, prepared, groomed to become queen. When Lady Elira arrived, an unknown noble's daughter with no political significance whatsoever, and swiftly claimed a position we had spent years cultivating, I acted out of desperation to protect my family's legacy, nothing more." "Your family's legacy does not grant you the right to threaten the life of an innocent woman," Caleb said, rising from his seat with barely contained fury radiating from every line of his posture. "Whatever ambitions House Hollis harbored for the throne, they ended the moment you chose violence as the means to reclaim them." Elira watched the confrontation unfold with a complicated tangle of emotions, fear from the reminder of how close danger had truly come, but also a growing, steady confidence born from watching Caleb defend her so fiercely, so completely, without hesitation. This was not the ruthless, feared king of rumor and whispered warning. This was a man whose ferocity existed entirely in service of protecting what he had claimed as his to cherish and defend. "The stone along the garden path," Caleb continued, his voice still carrying that dangerous, quiet edge. "Was that your doing as well?" Lord Garrick nodded miserably. "A servant loyal to my household, acting on my instruction. I believed a minor injury might convince her that court life carried too many hidden dangers for someone unaccustomed to its politics." "And tonight," Caleb said, cornering her privately during the banquet, delivering thinly veiled threats disguised as advice. "What was your intention there?" "A final attempt. Lord Garrick admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now, all pretense of dignity abandoned entirely. I had hoped fear alone might succeed, where subtler methods had failed. Caleb turned away from him then, running a hand through his dark hair, visibly working to control the fury that radiated from every tense line of his body. When he finally spoke again, his voice had regained some measure of controlled composure, though the cold authority underlying his words remained unmistakable. "You will be stripped of your council position immediately," he said. "House Hollis will forfeit significant portions of its lands and holdings as recompense for the danger you posed to the crown and to Lady Alira personally. You will remain under palace confinement pending formal judgment from the full council, and I promise you, Lord Garrick, that judgment will not be lenient." As guards moved to escort the broken, defeated nobleman from the study, Caleb finally turned back toward Alira, the fierce protectiveness in his expression giving way to something softer, more vulnerable, as he crossed the room to kneel before her chair, taking her hands gently in his own. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had not heard from him before. "I should have recognized the threat from House Hollis sooner. I should have protected you more completely from the moment you arrived here." "You couldn't have known," Alira said softly, echoing the same words she had offered him after Hessa's betrayal had been revealed. "And you found the truth. You protected me when it mattered most." "I will always protect you," Caleb said fiercely, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever comes, whoever threatens you, from your own family or from the ambitions of this court, I will stand between you and any danger for as long as I draw breath. That is not simply a promise, Alira. It is who I am, what this bond means, what you mean to me." Tears welled in Alira's eyes, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming weight of finally, completely believing in the safety and devotion this man offered her so freely. 17 years of neglect and cruelty had taught her to expect abandonment, to expect that any protection offered would eventually prove conditional or temporary. But watching Caleb confront Lord Garrick with such fierce, unwavering resolve, watching him kneel before her now with such raw vulnerability in his expression, she understood with complete certainty that this devotion was neither conditional nor temporary. It was permanent, unshakable, exactly as he had promised from the very first evening they had spoken in the throne room. "I believe you," she whispered, and meant it entirely. Caleb rose slowly, drawing her up with him, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, before resting his own forehead against hers, both of them simply breathing together in the quiet aftermath of the evening's danger. "Lord Garrick's punishment will send a clear message throughout the court," he said softly. "No one who threatens you will find safety within these walls, regardless of their standing or influence." Word of Lord Garrick's confession and subsequent punishment spread through the palace within days, carried by servants and nobles alike, until it reached every corner of the court. The message was received exactly as Caleb intended. Whatever remaining doubts lingered among the nobility regarding Alira's place beside the throne, whatever quiet resentments simmered beneath polite courtly smiles, none dared act upon them openly after witnessing the swift, decisive consequences that had befallen House Hollis. For Alira, the resolution of the threat brought a measure of peace she had not felt since her arrival at the palace months earlier. The dangers that had shadowed her early weeks in this new life, first from her own family's jealous scheming, then from the ambitious cruelty of a disappointed nobleman, had both been confronted and decisively resolved, each time with Caleb standing fiercely and completely at her side. As the autumn season began its slow transition toward winter, and the palace gardens shifted from vibrant blooms toward the quieter beauty of frost-touched branches, Alira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feeling genuinely, completely safe. The girl who had arrived at these gates months earlier, expecting cruelty, expecting to disappear the way the rumored brides before her supposedly had instead found something she had spent her entire life believing was impossible for someone like her to deserve. She had found a place where she was not merely tolerated, but treasured, protected, and loved. Winter settled over the capital in soft, drifting snow, transforming the palace gardens into a landscape of quiet white beauty, and with the changing season came a shift in the rhythm of palace life that Alira had not anticipated. The council, having concluded its formal proceedings against both Ophelia Voss and Lord Garrick Hollis, turned its attention toward matters that had been deliberately set aside during the preceding months of turmoil, namely, the long-anticipated announcement of the Crown's official succession plans. Caleb summoned Elira to his study one morning in early winter, his expression carrying an unfamiliar mixture of excitement and nervousness that immediately caught her attention. "The council has formally approved our betrothal," he said, unable to fully contain the warmth spreading across his features as he spoke. "There is no longer any obstacle standing between us and a formal announcement, Elira. Whenever you are ready, we can proceed toward a coronation ceremony that will make you not simply my bride, but my queen, recognized fully by the crown and the kingdom alike." Elira felt a surge of emotion so complete it nearly stole her breath entirely. Months earlier, she had arrived at this palace as a discarded daughter, sent away by a family who valued her only as a burden they were relieved to be rid of. Now, she stood on the threshold of becoming queen, chosen not for political convenience, but for a bond that had proven itself genuine and unshakable through every trial the preceding months had presented. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming emotion coursing through her. "I've been ready for weeks, I think, though I didn't want to rush you if the council needed more time." Caleb crossed the room quickly, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words ever could of the depth of relief and joy he felt at her answer. "Then we'll begin preparations immediately," he said against her hair. "A ceremony worthy of everything you deserve, worthy of the strength and grace you've shown through every difficulty this court has presented since your arrival." The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation, unlike anything Elira had ever experienced. Seamstresses arrived daily to fit her for ceremonial gowns of exquisite silk and delicate embroidery, each more beautiful than the last. Advisors briefed her extensively on the formal responsibilities awaiting her as queen, and though the sheer volume of information often left her feeling overwhelmed, Caleb remained a steady, patient presence throughout, never allowing her to feel burdened alone by the weight of her new role. It was during this period of preparation that a letter arrived from an unexpected source, delivered by a royal messenger who had traveled a considerable distance to reach the palace. Elira recognized the handwriting immediately upon opening the seal, and felt her heart leap with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The letter was from Tobias. Her younger brother had grown considerably in the months since her departure, judging by the careful, more mature handwriting that filled the pages, though the warmth and affection in his words remained exactly as she remembered. He wrote of hearing news of her rising standing at court, of the formal charges brought against Ophelia, of their parents' quiet, humbled retreat from public society following the scandal that had befallen the family name. He wrote, most importantly, of his own desperate hope that despite everything, despite the family's failures, she might still consider him worthy of her affection, worthy of remaining a part of whatever life she had built for herself. Elira read the letter 3 times before showing it to Caleb, tears streaming freely down her face by the final reading, though these tears carried none of the pain that had characterized so many of her tears in the past. These were tears of hope, of longing for the one member of her birth family who had never once treated her with anything but genuine love. "I want him here," she told Caleb, her voice thick with emotion. "For the coronation, if it's possible. He's the only family I have left who ever showed me real kindness, and I want him to see what I've become. Want him to know that leaving him behind was the hardest thing I've ever done." Caleb read the letter carefully himself, his expression softening with understanding as he reached the end. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I'll send an escort for him immediately, and arrange proper accommodations here at the palace. If he holds even a fraction of the character you've always described, he deserves a place of honor at your side during this transition, not distant separation." Tobias arrived at the palace 2 weeks later, and the reunion between siblings was everything Elira had hoped for and more. He had grown taller, his boyish features beginning to sharpen into the more defined lines of approaching adulthood, but the moment he saw her waiting in the palace courtyard, he broke into a run, closing the distance between them with the same desperate eagerness he had shown the night before her departure months earlier. "You're really safe," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder as he embraced her tightly. "I worried every single day. I kept thinking about what I heard the guards whispering the night before you left, about the king, about the missing brides. None of that was true. Elira reassured him, pulling back just enough to look at his face properly. Caleb has been nothing but kind to me, Tobias. Everything that's happened here, every trial I've faced, it's only made me more certain that this is exactly where I'm meant to be. She introduced Tobias to Caleb formally, later that same day, watching with quiet pride as her brother, despite his evident nervousness at meeting the king directly, spoke with earnest honesty about his hopes for his sister's happiness, about the guilt he still carried over his inability to prevent her from being sent away in the first place. "You were 12 years old," Caleb said gently, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "There was nothing you could have done differently, and nothing that requires forgiveness on Elira's part. What matters now is the family you choose to build going forward, and I would be honored to have you as part of ours." The words struck something deep within Elira, hearing Caleb speak so naturally of family, of building something new and lasting together that included not just the two of them, but Tobias as well, the one piece of her birth family worth preserving. It was such a stark contrast to everything she had known growing up, where family had meant conditional acceptance, calculated cruelty, and constant proof of her own inadequacy. Here, family meant choice, meant genuine affection freely given, meant building something new from the fragments of a painful past. As the coronation date approached, drawing steadily nearer with each passing day, Elira found herself reflecting often on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had traveled to the capital in a plain, weathered carriage, expecting cruelty and indifference from a king rumored to be as dangerous as the old stories claimed, had transformed entirely into a woman standing confidently on the threshold of becoming queen, surrounded by genuine love rather than calculated obligation. She thought often of her mother's dismissive words on the morning of her departure, of being called useless, of being told she should feel grateful simply for the opportunity to be sent away without complaint. She thought of Ophelia's calculated cruelty, of the schemes both her sister and Lord Garrick had orchestrated in their separate attempts to see her diminished or destroyed, and she thought, with growing clarity and strength, of how thoroughly she had proven every one of them wrong. She was not trash, discarded and forgotten. She was not useless, valuable only for what her absence might spare a family too ashamed to claim her. She was Elira Voss, soon to be Elira Ashgrave, chosen by fate itself, protected fiercely by a king the entire kingdom feared, and loved completely by the one member of her birth family who had never once wavered in his affection. The night before her coronation, she stood alone on the balcony outside her chambers, watching snow drift softly over the moonlit gardens below, and felt a peace so complete it settled into every corner of her being. Tomorrow she would stand before the entire kingdom, no longer the discarded daughter sacrificed to a ruthless king, but a queen chosen by fate, ready to claim a future that no one, least of all the family who had once cast her aside so carelessly, could ever have imagined for her. The morning of the coronation dawned clear and bright, the previous night's snowfall blanketing the palace grounds in pristine white, catching the early sunlight in 1,000 tiny glimmers that made the entire capital seem to shimmer with quiet celebration. Elira woke early, long before Wren arrived to help her prepare, and spent a quiet hour alone by her window, watching the city slowly stir to life beyond the palace walls, church bells beginning their joyful ringing to announce the historic occasion awaiting the kingdom. Wren arrived shortly after, accompanied by 3 additional seamstresses who fussed over Elira's gown with meticulous care, a masterpiece of pale silver silk, embroidered with delicate patterns of silver thread that caught the light with every movement, paired with a deep blue cloak trimmed in white fur that Caleb himself had specifically requested, a nod to the colors traditionally associated with his family's ancient bloodline. "You look like you belong to legend, my lady," Wren said softly, as she carefully arranged Elira's dark hair into an elegant crown of braids, woven through with small silver ornaments that caught the candlelight beautifully. "I never imagined this," Elira admitted, studying her own reflection in the tall mirror with something like disbelief. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, plainly dressed girl who had arrived at these palace gates months earlier, expecting nothing but cruelty and indifference. Not any of it, not the kindness, not the safety, and certainly not this. "Fate has a way of finding the people who deserve good things most," Wren said with a warm smile, even when the world has spent years trying to convince them otherwise. The words settled deeply into Elira's heart as she made her final preparations, and when the appointed hour finally arrived, she found herself standing at the entrance to the grand cathedral adjoining the palace, Tobias waiting nervously beside her in formal attire that Caleb had commissioned specifically for the occasion, ready to walk her down the aisle, in the absence of the father who had so carelessly cast her aside. "Are you ready?" Tobias asked, offering his arm with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief at the transformation his sister's life had undergone. "I've never been more ready for anything," Elira said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The cathedral doors opened to reveal a sea of assembled nobility, filling every pew, every available space along the walls. All turned expectantly toward the entrance, where Elira now stood. She recognized many faces from the court, some who had shown her genuine warmth during her months at the palace, others who had remained coldly distant, uncertain of her staying power until this very moment proved otherwise beyond any doubt. Near the front, she caught sight of Mistress Yara, dressed in her finest formal attire, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, and Corwin, the king's loyal advisor, watching with quiet satisfaction as the ceremony he had helped orchestrate finally reached its conclusion. And there, at the end of the long aisle, standing before the cathedral's ornate altar beneath soaring stone arches that stretched toward heaven itself, stood Caleb, dressed in ceremonial robes of deep blue and silver, his amber eyes finding hers the moment she appeared in the doorway, filled with an emotion so raw and complete that Elira felt tears prick unexpectedly at her own eyes before she had even taken her first step down the aisle. The walk toward him felt both impossibly long and impossibly brief, every step carrying her further from the pain and rejection of her past, and closer toward a future built on genuine love and unshakable devotion. Tobias released her arm gently at the base of the altar steps, pressing a final, proud kiss to her cheek, before stepping back to join the assembled witnesses, and Elira climbed the remaining steps alone, meeting Caleb at the top with hands that trembled slightly, though not from fear. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal ritual, sacred vows exchanged before the assembled kingdom, promises of partnership and protection, spoken with a sincerity that resonated through every corner of the vast cathedral. When the officiating priest finally placed the delicate silver circlet upon Elira's head, formally naming her Queen Elira Ashgrave before the entire assembled court, a swell of applause and joyful cheering erupted through the cathedral, the formal culmination of a journey that had begun months earlier with a family's careless cruelty and ended instead in a love story no one, least of all Elira herself, could have predicted. Caleb turned to her then, his expression carrying the same raw, unguarded emotion she had glimpsed that very first evening in the throne room, when the bond between them had first revealed itself so unexpectedly. "My queen," he said softly, meant only for her, despite the crowded cathedral surrounding them. "My king," she replied, and the smile that broke across his face in response was unlike anything she had seen from him before, pure and unguarded joy, replacing every trace of the fearsome reputation that had once preceded him. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, a grand feast held within the palace's largest hall, filled with music and laughter, and the warm glow of celebration that Elira had never imagined might one day surround her. She danced with Caleb beneath glittering chandeliers, watched Tobias laugh freely among newly made friends, among the younger nobility, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she truly belonged somewhere completely and without condition. Later that evening, as the formal celebrations began winding down and guests slowly departed toward their own chambers or carriages home, Elira and Caleb slipped away together to the same garden where their friendship had first begun to bloom months earlier, now transformed by winter into a landscape of quiet, snow-draped beauty, beneath a sky brilliant with stars. "Do you remember what you told me, that first morning in the garden?" Elira asked, leaning into Caleb's warmth as they walked together along the familiar paths. "I remember every word of that conversation," Caleb said softly. "I told you that I couldn't promise perfection, but that I would never treat you the way your family treated you. You've kept that promise," Elira said, "and so much more besides. I came here expecting to disappear, Caleb. I came here believing I was exactly what my family always told me I was. Worthless, unwanted, disposable. And instead, I found someone who saw value in me that I couldn't even see in myself. Caleb stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, his amber eyes catching the starlight in a way that made them seem to glow softly in the darkness. "You were never worthless, Alira," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were simply waiting for someone brave enough, patient enough, to see the truth your family was too blind and too cruel to recognize. I am the fortunate one in this story, not you. Fate gave me a gift I never knew I was searching for, the moment you walked through those throne room doors." Alira felt tears slip freely down her cheeks now, though these tears, like so many others in recent months, carried nothing but overwhelming joy and gratitude. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling both new and completely natural on her tongue, a truth that had been building steadily within her heart across every trial and tender moment of the preceding months. "I love you," Caleb echoed, completely, unconditionally, for exactly who you are, not for what you can offer this crown or this kingdom, but simply for the extraordinary woman fate was wise enough to choose for me. He kissed her then, gently, beneath the winter stars, sealing the promise that had begun the very first moment his fated bond had recognized her presence in that grand, echoing throne room months earlier. The girl who had once been called trash by the very family meant to cherish her had become a queen, not through political maneuvering or calculated ambition, but through the simple, undeniable truth of a bond that fate itself had chosen, and through her own quiet, unshakable strength in surviving every trial placed before her along the way. As they stood together in the quiet, snow-covered garden, the entire kingdom sleeping peacefully beyond the palace walls, Alira understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges the future might still hold, she would never again face them from a place of powerlessness or unworthiness. She was Queen Alira Ashgrave now, chosen by fate, protected by love, and finally, completely, exactly where she was always meant to be. The story of the discarded daughter who became a beloved queen would be told throughout the kingdom for generations to come, not as a tale of tragedy or cruelty, but as a testament to the truth that worth is never determined by those who fail to recognize it, and that sometimes the family we are born into is not the family fate intends for us to keep. Sometimes, fate simply waits patiently for the right moment to reveal the family, and the love that was meant to be ours all along.